In this video, I'm going to be covering the astrology of sadomasochistic relationships. But before I go over the particular astrology, I want to explain the psychology and the history of sadomasochism for those of you who may be watching and are unfamiliar with it. And as I go over specifically the history of sadomasochism, the particular photo that I've chosen for the background of this video will start to make more sense. So in sadomasochistic relationships, there are two roles, the sadist role and the masochist role. The sadist pathology is one of externalized or projected guilt. The sadist handles their guilt by having thoughts such as, I did something against my conscience or against natural law, but it was the other person's fault. The sadist lacks self-responsibility or the ability to own up to their own sins. A common example of this would be the person who becomes triggered and lashes out in anger. So instead of owning their own feelings, they will feel as if they are being attacked. They will feel like they are a true victim and will feel justified in projecting their pain onto the person who made them angry. So Adam in the Garden of Eden myth is a good archetypal figure of the first sadist. And instead of taking responsibility for eating the apple, he blames Eve for her weakness in tempting him. The masochistic pathology is one of internalized or assumed guilt. The masochist will handle their guilt by having thoughts such as, I did something against my conscience or natural law, and it was my fault. So in this way, the masochist takes responsibility for their sins or misdeeds. They own their guilt and therefore seek to atone for that guilt through penance or self-punishment. So Eve is a good figure for the first masochist. Now I'd like to go into the origins of sadomasochism as they correlate to Judeo-Christian religion and history. And I feel it's important to go into this because sadomasochism is still deeply ingrained in present-day man. And if we don't understand the origins of it, we really have little hope of healing ourselves of it. So if we think about the history of the people who wrote the Old Testament, we can begin to find how sadomasochistic psychology made its way into what would become Christianity. The people of the Old Testament were an enslaved and abused people, and sadomasochism has everything to do with abuse and oppression. Whenever an individual or even a collective people go through abuse, their suffering becomes a part of their identity. And when a person or persons' identity, dignity, and self-esteem are stripped away, they are left without a true connection to self. So their internal emotional body and ego are consequently shattered and lost. This creates an adaptation for an external ego or identity of specialness through suffering to emerge, because this is the only ego that abuse allows them to have. This identity is masochistic in nature, as it proclaims, I am worthy of love, protection, favoritism, etc., because I suffer. This, of course, is false and is a very sick form of programming that is the unfortunate byproduct of abuse at the hands of another, as it teaches us that in order to be worthy of another person's time, attention, whatever, we must suffer in some way. And this became the psychology of those persons who would end up being the authors of the New Testament and of Christianity. Through the oppression of their abusers, the people of the Old Testament became the self-proclaimed chosen people of God, whom God protects over and above their oppressors. They are also the people who are promised a future Savior or Messiah who will one day deliver them from their oppressors. And this is according to their own thoughts and beliefs as recorded in their Old Testament writings. They have this ideology where they are special and favored by God due to their suffering. Then the story continues through the New Testament, where Jesus is portrayed as the ultimate masochist, as he ends up taking on the suffering of everyone in the whole world out of love for them. Now, I'm not saying that this was not indeed Jesus' true mission on earth. This is something that we cannot really know for sure. It's a matter of faith. But given the sadomasochistic mindset of his 12 followers, it makes you wonder what personal beliefs and attitudes these 12 followers may have projected onto Jesus when they created this new religion that would come to be called Christianity. Sadly, the unhealthy sadomasochistic idea of love is still very alive and well, especially in countries and cultures whose ancestry is Judeo-Christian in nature. Take, for instance, the Bible passage, "Greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends." This passage speaks volumes as to how Christianity promotes the concept of love equaling suffering. And such notions are continually programmed into minds through not only religion, but popular films such as superhero movies, where the superhero puts his or her own life in danger in order to save others. This seems a noble act, but in reality is a sick form of masochism that is highly unhealthy and toxic. And again, we can see the ego adaptation of being special through their suffering in the role of the superhero. Okay, let's now go into the astrology of sadomasochism. This correlates to the Pisces-Virgo axis, and I don't think it's coincidence that the Piscean age has been dated as spanning the years 1 through 2000 AD, which has been the time in history encompassing Christianity, or where Christianity has had this major influence on cultural thought, cultural belief, and the like. All the lessons surrounding abuse, both self and other-generated abuse, that collective humanity has had to learn over the past 2,000 years are beginning to be understood as we enter the Aquarian age, the age of personal enlightenment through liberation and deconditioning. The Aquarian age is a perfect natural next step, as it is the repeating experience of crisis through suffering that creates the personal analysis associated with Virgo. For example, after a certain thing repeats itself again and again in our life, most of us begin to see the patterning around it, and therefore begin to analyze its deeper meaning and why it keeps happening to us. This is the self-analysis that allows us to see our addiction to suffering and acts as the liberating agent that leads us into healing, the deconditioning, and coming into the true authentic self that is associated with Aquarius and the process of individuation. The fact that we are in the Aquarian age means that the collective is finally beginning this healing journey as a whole. These two energies of Virgo and Pisces work synergistically in the acting out of sadomasochism, both towards ourselves and others. When we are still addicted to suffering and are unconsciously repeating our abusive programming, Virgo acts as the crisis generator through things like inner criticism and the feeling of being lost or cut off from God and meaning of life, which is in reality being cut off from our inner self. So Virgo, in its feeling of, life is pointless, this being cut off from its polarity, which is that Pisces and is associated with the other side, God, the collective unconscious. The whole reason for that is due to the abuse that was experienced, where there was this loss of connection with the emotional body, with the true inner self. The primary aim of Virgo is purity through perfection, and the shadow side of this primary Virgo need is to become perfect or pure enough for the unconditional love that is found in Pisces, which Virgo can tell that it is lacking. Virgo is painfully aware of all its flaws. It believes it cannot be truly worthy of love because it is too flawed. It is imperfect, unlike the object of its love, which is some God external to itself. As children, the God of our lives is our parents. And if our parents are abusive, they instill in us this belief that we are flawed and cannot be loved as we are. And this sets up the inner critic that every abused person carries inside of themselves, and the belief that we are bad and are therefore unworthy of love and connection. And as adult children, or adults who are still carrying around their inner abused child, God becomes some externalized identity who is keeping count of our imperfections or sins, quote-unquote sins. This pathology is exactly the whole basis for certain forms of religion, if we think about it. We take our subconscious mommy and daddy issues and project them externally, in the belief in some supreme being that we call our Father, who will send us to hell if we do not do as we are told. This model of God has us believe that love is conditional, just as our abusive parents' love was conditional. This is why the dogma of sin is infantile and abusive. So Pisces comes into the mix through things like poor boundaries, isolation, addiction, self-hate, and self-punishment via Virgo's inner critic. And all of these dysfunctional ways of handling Piscean energy lead to escapism and into the fantasy realms of the Piscean roles, which are the addict, victim, psychic, savior, martyr, mystic, and the like. Now, if you notice something about these Piscean roles, they are all grandiose and involve a fair amount of suffering. When it is operating out of its shadow expression, Pisces becomes the superhero of their and others' lives, imagining that it is their job to take on the suffering of any and everyone. And this is the egoic adaptation of specialness through suffering that I mentioned earlier, which is the foundation of the Christian religion. Another thing that Pisces rules is the dissolution of boundaries. When this takes place via abuse, the consequences are never good. This lack of boundaries manifests externally in the kind of work Pisces people can often be found engaged in. Pisces is often known as the bleeding hearts of the world and will usually be found in work such as animal advocacy or rescuing, and work with the homeless or other vulnerable groups in society. The people who do this type of work usually have an afflicted or negatively aspected sun, south node of the moon, or moon in Pisces or the 12th house. Subconsciously, Pisces individuals still operate from the shadow of their abusive programming and do this work as a way to try to save both themselves and the abuser. They know what it is like to have lived through great personal pain, and they therefore have great compassion for the vulnerable. They also love their abuser and may want to try and save others the way they could not save the abuser. This lack of boundaries sets people up to continue the cycle of abuse as they become trapped in codependent relationships of all kinds. This is why in any 12-step group, step 1 is admitting that we are powerless over the other, whether that is the addict or the addiction. Trying to save others at the expense of our well-being is a toxic program we learned from the abuser. And until we begin to love ourselves enough to stop trying to save everyone else, we will not be able to heal. You can also recognize Pisces people by their love of art. They are very good at art forms such as photography, painting, and music. and they excel in different art forms because of their need to escape normal everyday reality. And this is, of course, due to the abuse that they find themselves in. You know, if your everyday reality is horrific and you can't escape from it, of course you're going to need to go into fantasy and the imaginal realms. And for this reason, they have an ability to tap into the idealistic beauty of the imaginal. Now that I've covered the shadow expression of Pisces and Virgo, let's examine the healthy expression of these two energies, or how sadomasochism is transformed into healthy relating. It's not until we do our inner child work and begin healing our abuse that we find true connection to God. Connection to the divinity within us comes about through reparenting our inner child and growing ourselves up through unconditional self-love and self-acceptance. When we nurture our inner child, we no longer feel so lonely or that life is meaningless because we have love from and connection to the one person we can always count on, which is ourself. This radical love and acceptance of ourselves, of our true self with all its flaws, needs, and our authentic personality heals all our codependence. This is the elevated expression of Virgo, the unconditional love and acceptance of all our flaws. Another healthy expression of Virgo is service that is performed with healthy boundaries. So instead of the masochistic service that is born out of the subconscious need for penance or self-punishment, in which we engage in the suffering of others while we try to save them, true service is about sharing our gifts with others instead of the unhealed suffering that we have in common with them. Healed Piscean energy encompasses unconditional love for ourselves and for others, as well as surrender to reality or what is, instead of our idealistic fantasy of how we, others, or anything else in the world should be. And part of this surrender to reality is learning that the only person we really have control over or can save is ourselves. Living in reality means we understand that we do not have any superpowers. We cannot save anyone else. It is also about the ability to connect to our true self via our subconscious mind, using things like our dreams or hypnotherapy, and bringing in that Virgo polarity to analyze whatever comes up for further healing and integration. We accept what comes up and we don't judge ourselves according to it, but use it as information to better connect with and understand ourselves.